So I will present in English and the takeaways from yesterday, because not everyone who's here was part of the meeting yesterday. And I must say, it took me 4 hours yesterday night to do this work, because it was very intense. We had I counted it, without the breaks, we had 8.5 hours of program. I mean, that's really speaking panels or workshops with more than 24 speakers, more because also the audience was involved. We had 3 greeting lectures, 1 keynote, 4 individual artist presentations of their artistic research projects. We had 6 artistic research workshops with all the participants, but in parallel sessions. After that, 6 consecutive presentations of the workshop outcomes and a panel discussion with 5 more speakers plus the audience. So it was a substantial program. What I'm now trying to do is I'm not trying to tell you the kind of linear story of these panels, but actually what I have done is I have written minutes, and there are more than 4,000 words in English, and at the end of my presentation you will get a link and you can download those minutes. What I try to do is rather sum up the takeaways and the discussions that we had across all the panels, because there were recurring themes and there were recurring issues, and maybe that also helps us a little bit to kind of pre-structure the discussions of today. So, and what struck me first of all, that there was some consensus. So there were some discussions that I often had at artistic research conferences in the past, which we didn't have yesterday, and that was first of all, well, the legitimacy of artistic research. Nobody disputed that, because sometimes you can have those discussions. Another point was that pretty much everyone agreed that artistic research is characterized by its processuality and having an experimental character, and also a speculative and playful character. I think that was pretty much a takeaway, even if I looked at the positions that were contrarian or disagreeing. I think this is what pretty much everyone agreed upon. Yeah, and indeed that it's legitimate and contemporary. So this whole issue, is artistic research really something that is necessary or not, that fortunately was no longer part of the debate. But let's go to the controversial points, where we had debates and differences of opinion. So first of all, there was the question, what is the relation to university academic and scientific research, where some of the positions were clearly locating it as, you could say, an interface or an interaction with university academia, and others not, or even others even had the position that it is something that is primarily self-organized by artists. Another point was, let's say, an open question, which maybe sometimes we could resolve, sometimes not, depending on the speakers and positions, is artistic research different from art practice in general? So can you say artistic research is a subset, is a specific form of artistic practice, or can you say that there is artistic research in any art practice? I think this is not something that we definitely resolved in the discussions. Then the other point is it something new or not? There was a strong point being made that, for example, here at the school, it is something new as a discourse and as a name, but maybe it is something that already explicitly or implicitly has existed for centuries, if not millennia, in art. That, again, I think it's very closely related to this question is, does art have research character by definition, or can you describe artistic research as something more specific? Another point was, a really recurring theme yesterday was, is artistic research by definition a collective endeavor, or can it also be solitary? And there again we had the historical examples that whenever something was more or less, for example by Max Weber already in the 1920s, described as research activity by artists, often it were the kind of solitary geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci, whereas what we see as contemporary artistic research very often is collective and transdisciplinary. And again, the question is that is it collective and transdisciplinary by definition? Also, where do you draw the line? So, for example, is it already sufficient to speak of a collective endeavor if, for example, it occurs in institutional settings or as a workshop practice with audiences, even if there's only one artist, etc., etc. Something we didn't really resolve. Then the question also is, does the research paradigm for art mean that art has a new form of outreach, also in society? Is artistic research that is primarily happening in larger society and therefore also creates, let's say, a new public relevance for art? Or is it something that has constraints or is institutionally constrained? Because again, if you look at artistic research as something that's primarily happening in its own research institutions and is academic, then maybe the first is not the case. And that brings us again to this question, is artistic research something that is self-organized? This is where Michael Hildbrunner made a very strong argument in his keynote speech. Or is it also something that, well, can be institutional or even might be understood as being primarily institutional in the sense of being, let's say, owned by academic or research institutions? Another point brought up by Michael in his keynote, and it really stuck. I mean, everyone reacted to it more or less. He made a really strong argument for saying, if you look at artistic research practice and you see that there's an archival element of it, namely something like a process documentation in whichever form. It can be in a physical archive, it can be in other discursive forms, but the important thing that according to Michael, differentiates artistic research from other forms of art is that there is some form of, traces, archaeology, archive of that process. And if it's not, if art is being produced as something that kind of shuts out this whole visibility of the process, then according to you, it is not artistic research. And everyone had an opinion on this, and some people strongly disagreed. So that was an interesting point. A really interesting argument, by the way, came from the audience of someone who referred to the unofficial art practices in Dresden. I myself had to think of, for example, A.G. Geiger or Eigen and Art, where he said, well, it couldn't be archived because those were the political constraints. So the documentation of the process took place in personal conversations. Anyway, so I found this very inspiring. But aside from these, let's say, theoretical points or even political points, we had a lot of practical examples, both in the presentations and in the workshops. And I'm now not naming the artists, but I try to summarize them or describe them. For example, feminist art interventions in the public space is something that already started in the early 1970s. Experimental teaching at self-organized schools as a form of artistic research, or an art space that focuses on collective process and debates. All these three examples are from Michael's keynote. But then Documenta 15 was brought up in the discussions repeatedly to say actually what Documenta 15 is doing right now with these open formats, with these participatory, transdisciplinary workshop formats, that is actually a kind of beacon of what artistic research is today. But also another individual project I was presented was research that was supposed to be research on the interfaces between artificial intelligence research and contemporary art, and ended up as research on the soundscape of a server farm as the kind of hidden underbelly of AI technology. Also the materiality and also the waste going into AI technology. Or a mixed reality performance with archival materials from a Sri Lankan dance company that was founded in the early 20th century. Where the mixed media or the augmented reality was used in order to kind of reactivate these archival materials. There was the example of a design research book of cloud photos that were taken by an early 20th century Japanese physicist, actually as meant to be part of physical research, but then having a kind of aesthetic and artistic research quality that exceeded the original hard science research that actually never worked the way that the researcher had intended. There was an example by an artist who performed daily schedules, rigorous schedules that were written, superimposed to her by others, and another performance she did was giving herself quality feedback on her own daily actions. There was a workshop with soil field testing, which is a very kind of hands-on method of taking probes from soil and without any kind of measuring equipment or electronic equipment, telling something about the soil by feeling it, hearing it, etc. And that is actually something used in university soil research that has a close affinity to artistic research. Performative writing, experimental archiving of a university collection, in this case of dye samples. It's a beautiful, it was really like going into a kind of treasury or Wunderkammer of research of the Technical University. An electroacoustic musical experiment with spinners. So these were just as different practices which were, let's say, presented in a larger extent or in more detail. And if I were to summarize them, all these examples that I listed on the page before, then I would say you could maybe comprehensively describe them as either social action research, experimental pedagogy, critical discourse, creation of public experimentation spaces, such as at Documenta 15, experimental archiving, archaeology of scientific research, or even scientific research as art practice, or finding the kind of hybrids between art practice and scientific research. Also, many social real-life experiments where something was performed on the body of the artist or the participants, and material experiments. I'm not claiming that this is a complete list, but this is at least the takeaway from yesterday, and it gives a kind of impression of the scopes that artistic research can have. That also means that if you look, then I'm trying to abstract a little bit more, right? First I described the concrete performances, then I try to kind of summarize them, and if you would look from outside, you could maybe describe it as public interventions or institutional interventions, or even the creation of alternative institutions, the creation of alternative public space, what is happening at Documenta 15, for example, or even aesthetic science, if you take the cloud photographs, personal life experiments, aesthetic material experiments, or experimental processes. Yeah? It's another way of trying to kind of summarize of the scope of artistic research endeavors that we were told about yesterday. So, what are controversies and open questions? And there I'm coming to the end of my presentation. I mentioned some of them in the beginning, but I'm trying to kind of focus them more or come more to the kind of core debates. Collectivity was something that was controversial throughout the debates. The archival paradigm was something that was controversial throughout the debates. Is archiving, let's say, necessary or a defining characteristic of artistic research or not? Then also, which academic research paradigms to relate to? Whether artistic research takes place in public, in larger society, or in institutions. Also, another point was to which degree is it autonomous, and to which degree is it dependent, for example, on platforms and on tools and technologies that are not developed by the artists themselves. And then the last question indeed is, can you differentiate artistic research from art in a larger sense? Is it a subset, or is it more or less the same? Is there art that is not artistic research? Those were the main things that were still open to debate, and maybe we reach more conclusions today. What I did is, since I didn't give you a linear narrative and didn't really give you a, let's say, block-by-block summary of yesterday, I actually wrote that summary, and this is the snapshot of the pages. It's more than 4,000 words, plus some pictures from this beautiful die collection of Dresden Technical University. And you have to bear with me because I did this literally yesterday night. So we ended the conference at around 7:30. I went to my hotel room and worked like 3 or 4 more hours to clean up my notes. But I think there are lots of typos and misspelling still in it because I wasn't so focused anymore after this really intense day. But despite the fact that it's not editorially cleaned up, you can download it. This is a QR code, and below is the URL. So I just uploaded it to my own web server, and I want to freely share it. Maybe we can also find a different way. Maybe I can also put it on a USB stick and spread it through the USB stick. So for those for whom this code is now not very convenient, then we can also do a sneakernet Samistat operation where we copy the file on the USB stick.